Imagine this. You are walking through this massive outdoor marketplace. It's kind of like your local farmer's market, but so much bigger and so much crazier. It's the kind of place where everyone and their dog is trying to sell you something. And so if you can picture it, the marketplace is filled with stalls, piled high with different things. The air is buzzing with an energy. And that's because there's music blaring over here and there's people haggling over prices over there. And everywhere you look, vendors are shouting at you to try and get your attention. It is completely overwhelming. And then amongst all that chaos, something pretty cool happens. You catch a voice. It's not yelling like everyone else. It's not blasting from a loudspeaker, but somehow in all of that noise, their words are the words that cut through to you. And this is crazy because everyone else is just trying to get louder and louder and louder. But the person who got your attention, they did something different. They said something different. They tapped into your needs. They tapped into your emotions. It's like they know what you're into. It's like they know what you're searching for. And so the question is really, how did they get your attention in that overly crowded marketplace? It wasn't by being the loudest. They did it by being the most in tune with what you really wanted. It's almost like magic. And so in this episode, we're talking about that type of magic, how to stand out and differentiate yourself in a market. And we're talking with today's special guest, Mark Levy, who is a differentiation expert. I want to welcome you to the How to Sell More podcast, where each week we dig into one of the 4 pillars of sales success. We're talking about branding, marketing, sales, and customer experience. And we do that to help B2B leaders face the number one challenge every company struggles with, and that's growing revenue. I'm your host, Mark Drager. Let's get into it. So Mark, I'm really excited to be able to dig into this topic with you because you are a differentiation expert. So you started a company in 2001. So you're going on 23 years now. And then you've worked even before that. So I'm going to peg you and say, you have a bit of an experience helping people with positioning, with differentiation, and you have a 5-step process. And I want to jump straight to the 5th step because you mention in your breakdown to stop being so rational. And as someone who is, our agency helps people with positioning, with differentiation, and with creative services and all these things, I find myself daily questioning on the spectrum of rational decision-making to emotional decision-making. And depending on the type of sale, the type of product or service, whether it's B2B or B2C, whether you're dealing with someone who's more junior who has to sell through up, or whether you're dealing with someone more C-suite, whether someone's more shoot from the hip entrepreneurial or more corporate and they have, investor relations they have to deal with. I'm constantly going like, how the heck do you balance on the spectrum from the most rational, data-driven decisions to the most emotional decisions where people just want to work with people that impress the pants off of them?
Right.
How do you figure this out? Like, how do you, before you even start working on the differentiation and snazzing things up and punching people in the face with making things awesome, how do you know how important the rational data is versus the emotional, let's just move ahead because these guys are the best and we want to work with IBM?
Right. So great question. One of my favorite subjects. And by the way, some of the ideas I'm going to talk about, I love a book by a gentleman who I know, Rory Sutherland from the UK. He has a book, I think, called Alchemy. So some of the things that I'm going to say, Rory touches on in that book. So where I want to go with this is I've been doing this forever. I've been doing this for, as you say, 23 years. And I have a background. This is important where I come from. So I have a background. I did pitching over 25,000 times live for money and made over $1 billion for. So pitching.
Hold on. Network marketing or MLM, or what do you mean?
No. I sold books. It was a very ethical thing that I was the director of sales of and the 3rd largest book wholesaler in North America. We'd buy millions of dollars worth of books from Random House, Simon & Schuster, Doubleday, and so forth. And then we'd sell them to independent bookstores and chain bookstores and so forth. So I would have to quickly look at a book and size up what made that book important, or if it was important, and what had changed in society since the company had decided to publish it or not. There were all kinds of variables.
So in this situation, which I love, so you're dealing with all of these different people, and a bookstore is 100% about the shelf space, right? Like you only want to put product on the shelves that will sell, that will turn over, or what have you. So I love that you're in there having to like a sentence or two, trying to capture the attention.
If you're interesting, people will hang out for as long as you need to.
Really, about a book?
Occasionally on for a sentence, but sometimes much longer. So anyway, there was all this product that I had to size up very, very quickly and then pitch it like immediately. Like there was no like thinking about it. It was like, how do I pitch this immediately? So it's that kind of aesthetic that I bring to the work I do, that there's a lot of immediate understanding of a situation or whatnot. Essentially, what I like to tell people is I look at their business, and I've worked with someone from the White House. I've worked with so there's some major players involved here. So I don't want to make it seem marginalized what I'm doing. But I essentially look at people's lives or their business or their product or their service as if it was a book. I very quickly say, what's the main idea of this quote unquote book that you have written with your life or your business? What are the satellite ideas? What are the supplementary ideas? What are the stories? What are the lessons from it? And if we moved one of those ideas to the front, or we put two ideas together that hadn't gone together earlier, would it be a better selling book, quote unquote? And how would we pitch it? So there's a degree to that, Mark, of irrationality. We can say irrationality, but really, I think what I mean by irrationality in the situation is there's a rationality that isn't fully articulated yet. So another thing that is very, very important to me, right? We're talking about the power of irrationality and how you need to get irrational, and that organizations and brands and thought leaders and people like that often stay too close to the rational in planning their stuff, which is why what they create and what they talk about is always so boring and no one wants to pay any attention to it.
But this must be, I believe that this is driven by almost not necessarily a fear, but a lack of confidence, feeling you need to convince someone that your product has a place, that your service has a place, that your message has a place. And so we fall into the rational only because we somehow believe that just going out there and making the boldest claims, the biggest claims, saying what only you can say in the way that only you can say it, and saying something worth listening to is too fluffy or is not enough to sell. Like, it's just not enough to hang your hat on.
Well, when you stick to what we think of, and again, these labels like rational and irrational, they're just labels. What I had said before is I'm calling what I do irrational, but really there's a rationality that just hasn't been articulated yet.
Okay.
And right. So I appreciate what you just said, and I agree with it. But it's this idea that the rational only stays 1 or 2 percentage points to the right or left of what already exists. So when you stay too rational, you're going to be using very similar claims and ideas and tactics that everyone has used before you, because that's what rationality is. It's this very specific box. It's this bubble that was decided upon. This is what makes sense in this situation. But anyone you know who's done something extraordinary, they operate by irrational means or by a different rationality. And so I was talking about about Rory before. So an idea that he had talked about this was the idea. He said something like, the major entrepreneurs in this world who we all idolize, or even if we question them, we still appreciate that they have the guts to do certain things. He said, They operate by a logic that would never be okayed by a committee. Right. They operate by a logic. That's why they are seen as quote unquote certifiably bonkers. It's people like Steve Jobs, like Elon Musk, like Peter Thiel, right, from PayPal, James Dyson. No one was asking James Dyson, or no one was asking the marketplace, I want a very expensive vacuum that's very complex, that's very pretty. No one was asking for that. And so this idea, I think it was the director, I think David Cronenberg, Canadian.
There you go. There you go.
Right, the guy who did The Fly with Jeff Goldblum and whatnot, art house director. So Cronenberg, 30 odd years ago in Rolling Stone magazine said, I think it was Cronenberg, he said something like, the entertainer gives you those old songs you know and love so well. The artist gives you what you couldn't know you want this time, but you know you'd want next time. So what I like to do when I'm working with people, it's organizations who like genuinely want to be like breaking new ground. I work with a lot of companies, for want of a different phrase, who are saving the world. Like I work with lots of companies.
Have you ever watched Silicon Valley, the TV show Silicon Valley?
No, I know.
Oh my God, there's a great scene where they're at a tech conference, and all of these startups, these pre-revenue startups, are pitching for the opportunity to get like a $50,000 grant or something, or maybe it's $500,000, or who knows what it is. But they're pitching in this contest, and they do a montage where they cut from every single founder said, essentially, we're trying to use, and then they explain this really complex thing, to save the world. So they'll say like, we've created this complex algorithm to help reduce the weight and the server time speed of, this, and this to save the world. And everyone would clap. And I was like, it just hits a little too close to home, all that Silicon Valley.
I love that. Well, by the way, from the work that I do and the work you do, if someone told me that what it is they do is about saving the world, the very first thing I would say is, I believe you. How do you go about saving the world?
Oh, see, what I would say is, what does that even mean?
Right. What are the specifics? Because saving the world is very much a judgment. What's saving the world for me is not saving the world for you. So what is it? Like, what's the judgment? What are the metrics? What are the things that show me that you're trying to save the world? But where it is I'm going with here is I work a lot with organizations and firms and so forth that they actually want to be the leader in a very genuine and real way. And to be the leader, you actually have to do something different than other people are doing. Someone I know, a wonderful therapist, his name's David Reynolds. David Reynolds said something like, he said, our greatest desire is to stand out, and our greatest fear is to stand out. And so you know this from the work you do, to stand out. The good news is we can make you stand out. The bad news is you really need to stand out. And to do that, you have to do something. You have to have a claim. You have to have a product. You have to have a feature. You have to have something that's genuinely different from and different for a real reason.
Well, like different for a real reason.
Not and a trite reason.
Ideally, something that is highly valued or understood or impressive to your targets, right? I mean, it can't just be different for difference sake.
That's right. If theirs is like blue and yours is green, that's not really a good idea. I'll give you an example of something that potentially could sound trite, but it's not. So many years ago, there was a restaurant in New York City, which was open for decade, like 70 years. It actually closed during COVID, but it was super successful before then. And they were the first place I knew in New York City that they would serve a deli sandwich a foot high. Now, right? Like, so you'd be waiting there and you'd order your pastrami and all this stuff, and it would be a foot high. But think about it. You're in a deli like that, it's a social gathering. You're usually there with a friend, there are other people around you. And so when they bring you this thing
Yeah,
that's
yeah. What an experience.
tall, suddenly everyone's looking, everyone's talking, you're having conversations, because food is very social. So what it does is it gives you something to be social around. And today, if you got a sandwich like that, you'd be putting it on Instagram, you'd be taking pictures and whatnot. And the funny thing is that we're used to getting sandwiches that are a foot high. It's just that they're usually lying on their side. They're called Jersey Mike's and Subway and all these hero shops. Like, they serve it's just that they're laying down. But to stand up is this bizarre thing with all this meat. So I don't want to sound overly trite or so, but depending on what your product or service is or what you're trying to do, sometimes the way to differentiate is not something terribly sophisticated. It could be standing your sandwich up instead of lying it down.
So when you mentioned the sandwich, I kind of was like, ugh. Like, it's like the $1,500 hamburger. It's the gold leaf. It's the like, we serve our Philly cheesecake with a spoon because there's so much of this or whatever. And it's like, I don't know if I've spent too much time in advertising and marketing, because there is a certain cynicism and a certain like, oh, that's not cool or whatnot, versus like direct response or sales or people who go like, hey, this works. Like, this gets people's attention. And so when you're considering this or working with people, how precious are you versus like, hey, we need to do something. We need to stand out. The gap between what most people think it takes and what it really takes. Like most people who are not entrepreneurs think they understand what hard work is. And then you jump into it and you realize, oh, the gap is so much larger than I thought. So I have to, in my experience with differentiation, with standing out, with breaking through, like the gap between what you think will stand out and what will actually stand out is massive. So are you precious about this stuff, or is it just like, let's throw stuff, let's try things, let's not worry about being too cool or too kitschy or too this or too that?
Right. Great question. I would say that, so when I'm first contracting with a client, I actually ask them, like I say, what are the sacred cows? Like, what has to stay here? Like, what is it that you won't give up? And I say to them, I'm cool with that. Like, if these are necessary things that need to be there, we won't violate them. But other than that, I'm going to call you on stuff if we need, because in order to stand out, sometimes you have to do and
I also like to ask about skeletons in the closet, so I don't accidentally make something stand out. They want to bury.
Oh, that's really interesting. I love that. So they're going to have to get a little uncomfortable, but also you have to walk the line between what it is that they can actually do. Like, in other words, a C idea can be elevated to A status with the right execution, whereas an A idea will be dragged down to C status with lousy execution. So it's not only the idea, but it's their ability or their urgency or their vision on actualizing that idea. In other words, to put it in the simplest way possible, they need to make the idea great. It's very rare that we are going to come up with a point of differentiation that can work on autopilot, that you're going to have to do a lot in order to support that and talk to people about it and get people excited about it and lead conversations about it and show people how it can help them in their lives and whatnot. And if you're not in on it, it's not going to work.
So you find the point of differentiation, you test it, you make sure it works, but then you have to shout it from the rooftops. You have to educate on it, speak on it, hang your hat on it. You have to make sure it's front and center for everything, because it's not enough just to come up with the point, throw it on a box, throw it on your website, throw it in an ad, throw it on a landing page. And
that's right. Well, Well, I love what you're saying. The point I want to talk to, where you say you test it, which is true, we test it. But again, very often your point of differentiation, it might be something philosophic. It may not be a sandwich that's 12 inches high. It might be an idea, like start with why or something like that. Like it might be an idea depending on what work you do or not.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And sometimes again, I told you the Cronenberg quote about an artist gives you what you couldn't know you want this time, but you know you'd want next time. So often you need to lead the way with this idea. In other words, if you were to test it, people wouldn't understand what it was. You actually have to go whole hog in and commit to it and educate people on it and get people excited by it. I mean, there's ways of doing it that make things happen more rapidly, that accelerate. For instance, I'm a big believer in that you preach to the choir, that you sell mushrooms to mushroom lovers. There was a marketer named Greg Steelstra, who was the marketer for Dr. Rick Warren, right? Purpose-driven.
Yep. Purpose-driven life. Yep.
And so Steelstra, in one of his books, he said, and I'm paraphrasing it, but he said, I hate mushrooms. Mushrooms are slimy, they're rubbery, they're disgusting, they're a fungus. The mere fact of putting a mushroom in my mouth makes me want to retch. I hate mushrooms. But he said, there are people who love mushrooms, and now I'm going to lean in and say this very slowly. There are people who love mushrooms for the very same reasons I hate mushrooms. There are people who love mushrooms for the very same reasons I hate mushrooms. If you sell mushrooms for a living, the way to sell more mushrooms is not to grow a hybrid version of a mushroom that dumbs down its mushroominess in order to sell to me. Because you know why? I hate mushrooms. I'm not going to buy them. I don't care what you do to them. You take your mushroom in all the things I find awful about it, and you lead with that. Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead. Jerry Garcia, I'm using lots of food analogies. I don't normally do it. There's something about you, Mark, where I'm bringing all the stuff. But Jerry Garcia said, the Grateful Dead are a lot like licorice. Most people hate licorice, but the people who love licorice really love licorice. So to me, when you're leading the way, when you're leading the field, you're not as alone as you think. Because of the long tail in the world today, like there's so many groups out there who are going to share the philosophy that you want to get out there, that you will find the lovers. You'll find the right people out there. You know what I mean? So it's not like you're going to be a lone person in the wilderness. It's you sometimes need to build. Right? It's early adopters. Yeah.
I'm struck with two thoughts. So first, when I started my agency, my company, when I graduated, I went to film school. When I graduated and started working and started my company in 2006, it took me about 4 or 5 years to realize that there's a trap we fall into, where I spent most of my time trying to prove to people that I'm just as good as the established players. And then I got enough confidence to realize, no, it's not about being just as good as the established players. It's about being better or different or unique in some way. And then it took me 3 years to reposition and re-strategize and do everything else. It took me 8 years to learn this lesson, probably. And then I would go into speak to entrepreneur groups or startups or students even. And I would say, listen, you're going to spend so much time. You're going to waste a lot of time and a lot of energy trying to be just as good as everyone else. But if you're just as good as everyone else, there's no reason to pick you. You need to be different. You need to be better. So leapfrog, if you can, that uncomfortable feeling of trying to prove that you're just as capable as the established players, especially if you're in your 5th position or 8th position or 10th position. You don't spend your time comparing yourself to number one. Just leapfrog all of that and go out into the world right away from day one saying, this is why we're different. This is why we're unique. This is why we're better. And don't even spend your time comparing yourself to anyone else because you're not going to win at that game. And inevitably what people come back with is like, great, how do I do that? And I'd be like, well, that's your job. Like, that's your job to figure this out. Your job is to figure it out. Do you believe that there are ways that most of us can do this leapfrog, or do we have to learn the lessons the hard way, put in the time, realize, oh, this doesn't work before we will respect what does work.
Right. Um, you ask such great questions. I can tell you
Thank you.
really, I can tell
I
you
call it
really know,
overthinking everything.
right, right. You really know what you're doing. Because these are wonderful questions. One thing that I want to say based on what you're saying, I love everything you're saying. I don't want to get lost in the fact because we're focusing a lot on us as the business owner. It's if the marketplace, if people in the marketplace know that you understand them in a way that other people don't understand what they're going through, they will listen to whatever method you bring in order to help them to achieve the result they do. So nothing you said is wrong, but the thing that was lacking for me is, oh, it's looking at ourselves a lot. It's also really looking at psychographically and, about all the, I saw, I got a wonderful letter the other day in the mail. Because my wife and I we're not retiring, but we're reaching retirement age. And I got this, yes, yes. And
I love that. I love that point of like, let's make this clear.
I'm not retiring. I'm going another 20 years, man. But it was this great letter. It was like a regular letter. It wasn't fancy. And the guy said to my wife, like, dear so-and-so, he said, this is how the letter began exactly. He said, I'm probably the only engineer in the world who works full time at helping people understand how to work the Medicaid system. And he said, the reason being my parents needed to pick their Medicaid or their Medicare programs. And it was so confusing that I had to sit there and learn it and help them understand. And the entire letter, it's multiple pages, is this clarity of an engineer. Like he's got these boxes, which very clear. He goes on to say something like, to go through the healthcare system, understand it's like putting on layers of clothing for the winter. So you need multiple layers. One layer is not going to work. And you also need to know that when you put on layers for the winter, that you need to put them on in the right order. That you can't put on your jacket first and then put on your sweater over your jacket. So let me show you the order in which you need to do things. And then he had like tier one, like here's the first part, here's the second part. And I'm not saying we're going to use him or not, but it was so friggin' beautiful. It's like, yeah, an engineer, they think very clearly, they think very systematically. Medicare or navigating the health system is very complex. It's very complex. So
But is this not a rational approach, though? Is this not rational, like what you're even describing? I love it. It makes sense to me.
You could also argue that I am not going to hire an engineer to help me figure out the healthcare system. That to me is taking the irrational. He's leading with the irrational, saying, I am not I am not educated into this. I'm an engineer. But you know what? We engineers, we systematize things and we think very clearly. My parents needed to pick this, so I had to think clearly for them. Now, and he said, in the past 5 years, we've helped 414 people create their program, and it's like, it was just so beautifully done. And I would argue that came from a framework of irrationality because you wouldn't normally say, oh, I need to understand the healthcare system. Who here's an engineer? Does that make sense?
Oh, 100%. 100%. So
see, that's unfortunate that it makes sense. It shouldn't make sense because it's irrational.
Our strengths are our greatest weaknesses.
Right.
And one of my strengths is I'm usually pretty quick at synthesizing something because
Right. I can tell.
I
Yeah.
actually wanted to be an engineer, a civil engineer, and an architect, and then I got scared in high school and I went to film instead. But I'm not an artist. I am not an
Uh-huh.
artist by any means. So I'm constantly trying to look to connect the dots and try and make sense of things. But and this is maybe a great way to wrap up our conversation. I've been speaking with Mark Levy, and this has been amazing. Um, my final thought is: can a rational process allow us to arrive at emotional and irrational statements and claims?
Yes.
And
So,
okay,
yes.
how?
Well, so one exercise that I do with my clients, because it's hard to tell if people knew the right idea to differentiate around ahead of time, they wouldn't call you or me.
Oh
They
no!
wouldn't be
Thank
doing it.
goodness they can't figure this out.
Right. So I work from the premise that you don't know what it is. So to ask you to go to some super interesting place right away is fraught with peril. It'll freeze people. It'll get them like real, even very accomplished C-level people that I work with from major places. It would like freeze them up big time. So what it is I often do from the very beginning is I have them just list fact after fact after fact after fact about their business. Like, and they'll say, oh, about what? I don't know where you're located. What's the street address? How many people work there? Like, in other words, it couldn't be. Another way I do that is I ask the question, tell me about your business, everything that's obvious about it. And they'll say, what do you mean by obvious? I don't know, stuff that you would be embarrassed to tell someone because it's so simple.
Yeah,
So it's
but those are
either
the things. Those are the things they take for granted. I love that question.
when they start listing what's obvious, when they start listing what's factual. I cannot tell you the number of times where we're letting the faucet run. They're going through the facts and the obvious, and they go, wait a minute, I never thought about this. It happens like 70% of the time. And it's because that we screw ourselves up trying to be so smart and trying to find the right answer that we shut down our ability to think in interesting ways. But just by being obvious and factual, like you've lowered the standards, like the threshold is so low, there's no threshold there. And now you just start listing stuff and it makes you think about your business or your marketplace. Like I would say to them things, tell me obvious things about your marketplace, about your customers. Just obvious. Yeah. Oh, or factual. Go ahead. You know, what, blah, 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 blah. Oh, that's interesting. They hadn't thought, oh, what if we amplified that? But does that make sense? You don't go for the amplification
Yeah.
ahead of time.
No, that's
You
fantastic.
just go for laying stuff out on a blanket.
I was working maybe 6 or 7 years ago with one of our long-term clients, and we're their agency of record. We were taking them through a repositioning from a manufacturing firm to more of an environment design firm, trying to move them up earlier into the decision-making process so they weren't always getting RFPs competing on commoditized goods, but instead were earlier in the decision-making process with clients. So when we were going through this, you referenced Simon Sinek, and I know that you've worked with him in the past. We were working with him to discover their why, and we found out, this entrepreneur said, "We will do whatever it takes." I said, "Really? Whatever it takes? Whatever it takes? Whatever it takes? Whatever it takes to do the right thing for the project, even taking on all the risk of the project on behalf of the client." And I only found this out when we started talking about like, hey, projects that went sideways, projects that went wrong. This client owes you 200 grand. What do you mean they didn't pay? Like you financed the project for them? He said, we will do whatever it takes, because he's such a handshake, old school, value-based, principled person, right? And as we started talking about this design side of things, I said, we started getting into design and revisions, and I said, you'll do unlimited revisions? He said, well, we do whatever it takes. We'll do unlimited revisions on something. I said, well, why don't we talk about this? Oh, we couldn't talk about that. Well, why don't you talk about the fact that you finance projects on behalf of the client? Well, we couldn't talk about that because people would take advantage of us. Like the snakes out there will hunt us down and then take advantage of them. And I said, well, just like pre-qualify people and don't work with them. And then if people are taking advantage of you, don't work with them again or move up your pricing next time. Like the value of being able to say that you do these things out of value and out of principle, and that that moves all the way through the organization to the point where every single project you will do whatever it takes. And I really wanted to make sure this was true, but that they will do whatever it takes to do the right thing for the project, including taking on all risk and doing whatever it takes. I said, you will get so much more gains from the people who are honorable, and this will go so much further over the next few years. And yes, you'll have to weed out a few bad characters along the way, but the cost, the expense of that will in no way match the benefit of you actually talking about these things. And that only came from what you're describing, which is this idea of like let's just talk about stuff, the way you work, what you do, how you work. And
Don't try to
my
be
client
smart.
my client never thought to articulate this to anyone because he saw it as like a weakness. And I was like, what's the greatest thing ever?
I love that. And by the way, a quick addition to that. So you know Marshall Goldsmith, the
Yes.
oh yeah, Marshall's a wonderful man. So Marshall once said to me, because I don't know that he still, but his whole career, as far as I know, is considered the greatest management consultant in the world. Like, and so what he would do is you would pay for his travel for the year, but he would tell you what the fee was up front. You would agree to the fee, like 250,000, whatever. And then you would pay for his travel, but he wouldn't charge you anything until the end of the year. And at the end of the year, and they did measures and things. In other words, there was things that was done around it. But at the end of the year, he would send you the invoice saying, as we said, this project we agreed on this price. You can pay us this price or whatever you think the project was worth. In other words, so he didn't get any money. This is how unbelievably ethical, and he didn't take any money. And at the end, he said, yeah, here's what we said it was, but pay me what you, and I said to him, where did you develop that style of being? He said, when I was a teenager growing up in Kentucky, when I was 18 years old, I needed a summer job and we needed a new roof on my house. And so my father hired a local roofer and the roofer hired me to assist him on building our own roof. And so we worked for like a month or however long it took, like to build this roof. The guy didn't ask for any money at all, right? Marshall's a teenager. The guy hadn't asked for any money. They're building the roof, building the roof, building the roof. When he's finished, the guy asked Marshall's father to come up the ladder onto the roof and inspect the roof. And he went over what they had done and showed him the roof. And when Marshall's father gave him the thumbs up, then he said, okay, here's your invoice. In other words, and Marshall said that always stuck with me as the way that I wanted to be. That you know what I mean? Like that reminds me of that story that you just said. But it's these stories, it's these ideas, it's this factual stuff. Here you said that this person you were talking about thought of it as a weakness. And actually it was, a strength. It just beautifully put. Everyone who's listening to this, and knowing how smart you are, there's a lot of smart people listening to this. Everyone listening to this, you can take a lot of steps towards finding your differentiation by just listing like what's obvious about what you do and what's factual about what you do or so. And if you get stuck doing that, to me, it means you've raised the threshold too high. You suddenly in the middle started to try to be too smart or too professional or too good or try to come to an answer too quickly. Like you're screwing yourself. It's like lower that threshold. There was a famous poet, William Stafford, who died a few years ago. Stafford used to write a poem every single day. And someone said to him, how do you write a poem? Like some of the poems were long. How do you write a poem every single day? And he said, you lower your standards. And a lot of the poems will be crap, and some of them will be good. So the same thing with the facts and the obvious, and some of it'll be not worth it, and some of it will be worth it.
Hey there, it's Mark again. It's been a few weeks since I recorded that conversation with Mark Levy, and honestly, there were a few things that really stuck with me. So I want to share my 3 biggest takeaways from this talk. Number 1, we have to figure out a way to balance rational and emotional decision-making for ourselves, but also for our prospects. Businesses often struggle with trying to figure out what that right balance is between rational, data-driven decision-making and emotional, human-centric approaches. And of course, if we're going after the C-suite or executives, it's going to be totally different than if we're going after younger or lower level staff. And so finding that balance really is key. Takeaway number 2, effective differentiation is not just about being different. It's not different for difference sake, but it's about being relevant. It's about being valuable to your targets. And in the end, it's really about understanding what resonates with your potential customers and tailoring your unique selling proposition to their needs. And number 3, this is something I've really been playing with actually over the last few weeks. Even this episode, we are trying different techniques and approaches with my opening script and how we read it, because there is a power to storytelling. We have to be able to draw from our personal experiences, and we have to be able to share stories and just do a better job of crafting our unique selling propositions, our features and our benefits into real stories, because we know people like stories, we know people like narratives, but frankly, they're not huge fans of fact sheets. There you have it. Those were my 3 biggest takeaways from this talk. But I'm actually really curious, what were yours? Do you agree with me? Naturally, you should. Maybe you got something you want to argue about. That would be like my wife's approach. Either way, be a part of the conversation by heading over to LinkedIn and sending me a DM. My name is Mark Drager. I'm the guy in the black and white photo with the blue background. Now, while you're over there on LinkedIn, be sure to connect with Mark Levy. That's Levy. And I highly recommend you take a look at his books. He's got 2 books, which are Great Accidental Genius and the aptly named How to Persuade People Who Don't Want to Be Persuaded. And finally, if you want to learn more about Mark and his business, you could head over to levyinnovation.com. Now, one last thing while I've got you. If you made it this far into the show, you really should subscribe. And you might be saying like, okay, well, why is that? Well, every week I share practical strategies and tips, just like what Mark shared with us today, to supercharge your business growth and to boost sales. So with that, we're going to wrap up the episode. My name is Mark Drager. I will catch you in the next one.